This opening move, d4, immediately stakes a claim in the center and prepares to develop pieces, aiming for a solid pawn structure that controls key central squares. This move, nf6, is a flexible response that immediately controls the central e4 and d5 squares, allowing black to choose from various solid defenses like the Indian defenses, while preparing for kingside development. This move develops a knight towards the center, supporting a potential central pawn push and preparing for kingside castling while keeping options open regarding black's developing choices. This move, 2, d5, establishes a classical central pawn presence, aiming to control key squares and preparing for a robust pawn structure common in many queen's pawn openings. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a fundamental opening aiming to challenge black's central pawn on d5 and fight for control of the center. This move reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares to develop the queenside pieces, solidifying the queen's gambit declined formation. This move reinforces the central pawn and prepares for a pawn thrust like e4, typical in Slav and semi-Slav structures, aiming to gain space and initiative. This captures the pawn, temporarily weakening black's center but often leading to the Caro-Kann defense's mainlines where white seeks to regain central control. This move supports the bishop on c1, preparing to develop it to f4 or g5 to exert pressure on black's center and potentially challenge the d5 pawn. This move develops the bishop to an active square, pinning the knight and preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn in the center, reinforcing control of the d4 square and developing a piece to an active square, maintaining an even material balance. This move prepares to develop the kingside bishop to a more active square, aiming to castle quickly and reinforce the central pawn structure. This move proactively challenges the advanced black bishop on g4, forcing a decision on whether to retreat, exchange, or maintain its position, influencing the pawn structure and piece activity. This move, by retreating the bishop, aims to maintain the pawn tension on the queenside and avoid an immediate commitment, preparing to develop the queenside pieces after white's next move. Castling kingside establishes king safety and connects the rooks, preparing to bring them into active play in the center or on open files. This move completes black's development and prepares to castle, solidifying the kingside and aligning the bishop with white's central pawn structure for potential counterplay. This move challenges black's queen and aims to gain a tempo while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move challenges white's queen and prepares to castle queenside, aiming to destabilize white's central pawn structure and activate black's pieces on the queenside. This move initiates tactical skirmishes and potentially creates a strong outpost for the knight on e5, while also provoking black to reveal their intentions regarding the center. This move logically develops a piece towards the center and prepares to challenge white's centrally placed knight, which could otherwise become a powerful attacking force. This exchange simplifies the position by trading queens, forcing black to choose between developing their queenside pieces or solidifying their central pawn structure. The recapture on b6 opens the a-file for black's rook and prepares to challenge white's queens bishop for control of the long diagonal. This knight exchange simplifies the position, opening the a-file for white's rook and forcing black to recapture with the pawn, which may create some pawn structure weaknesses later. Moving the king to d7 secures it from the knight's attack, centralizes it slightly, and prepares to develop the remaining pieces, while also potentially activating the rook on a8 later. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to connect the rooks, aiming to leverage the open A file and potentially contest it. This move boldly challenges white's bishop, aiming to disrupt white's central control and gain active counterplay for black's rook on the A file after the bishop retreats. This move continues the bishop's development, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential central pawn advances, while also offering trade possibilities for white's bishop. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the queenside majority and preparing for potential pawn advances. Exchanging the bishop for the knight on g6 resolves black's structural weakness on the kingside and simplifies the position, allowing white to focus on developing a central advantage and exploiting the slightly passive nature of black's pieces. By recapturing with the pawn, black solidifies the pawn chain and opens the h-file for potential rook activity, aiming to compensate for white's bishop pair advantage and potentially develop counterplay on the kingside. This move establishes control of the open c-file, preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn majority and potentially create weaknesses on that flank. Developing the rook to a6 prepares to contest the open c-file and potentially support a b4 pawn advance, increasing white's space advantage. This move begins to secure white's queenside majority, preparing to advance the b-pawn and create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the c-file and offers black an opportunity to activate the rook on the semi-open file after potential exchanges. This knight maneuver redirects the knight to the queenside, aiming to control the c3 square and potentially support a future advance of the b-pawn. This move is a strong centralizing maneuver, bringing the knight to an active square where it controls important central squares and prepares to attack the d4 pawn. This move reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares to support a potential advance of the b-pawn, while also creating flexibility for the knight to potentially redeploy. This move initiates a strategic pawn break in black's queenside structure, aiming to liberate the f-pawn and create active play by challenging white's central control and potentially opening lines for the king and other pieces. This move improves the king's safety by tucking it away from the open c-file and potential checks, while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move repositions the rook to an active file, eyeing the potentially weak b2 pawn and preparing to challenge white's control of the queenside. This knight maneuver strategically repositions the piece to a more active square, aiming to contest the d5 square and potentially support a kingside advance or control central squares while preparing for a pawn break. This move is a defensive reaction to white's knight maneuvering, aiming to contest the open c-file and prevent white from reinforcing their central control. This move solidifies the pawn chain and prevents black's knight from finding a comfortable outpost on c3, while simultaneously preparing to challenge the open c-file. This move, by exchanging the active rook for the knight, opens the c-file for black's rook, creating significant attacking potential along the open column. This capture removes black's piece that was actively supporting their central pawn majority and clears the way for white's pawn majority on the queenside to advance. Black captures the pawn on a3, aiming to exploit white's weakened queenside pawn structure and open the a-file for potential future pressure. The bishop retreats to e1 to avoid further pressure from black's rook on a3 and prepare to contest the open c-file, while also creating a safer haven for the king. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control the c3h6 diagonal and potentially contest the open c-file. The king is brought to the center to join the defense and prepare for pawn advances, anticipating potential threats on the king side. This central pawn thrust liberates black's pieces and fights for space, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially create dynamic counterplay on the queen side. This capture on e5 opens the d-file for white's rook and creates a strong pawn majority on the queen side for black, while white retains a central pawn majority. The recapture of the pawn with the bishop on e5 develops a piece, prepares for potential pawn breaks in the center, and maintains central pawn presence for black. This pawn move aims to solidify white's central pawn structure and open a diagonal for the king's bishop, potentially preparing for further central pawn advances or king side activity. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, supporting the potential pawn advance on e5 and preparing to contest the crucial d6 square. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square where it controls the important diagonal, and supports a potential pawn advance on the king side. This check forces white's king to a less secure square, immediately activating black's rook and creating threats along the second rank. The king moves to a more active square on the f3 diagonal, seeking central influence and potential coordination with the remaining pieces while avoiding the check. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to exchange white's active bishop and create a passed pawn on the king side. The rook now occupies the open d-file, exerting pressure on black's uncastled king and preparing to support a pawn advance or participate in a central pawn break. The king actively enters the game by centralizing, preparing to support potential pawn pushes and contest the open d-file with the rook. The rook on d3 aims to consolidate the position by potentially supporting a pawn advance with e4 or preparing to relocate to a more active file like the c-file after capturing on c3. This retreat of the bishop to f8 aims to defend the weak d6 pawn and potentially prepare to reinforce the center or reroute the bishop to a more active square. But it also allows white to consolidate their pawn structure. This move redeploys the bishop to a more active square, aiming to challenge black's control of the central dark squares and potentially support a kingside advance or prepare for piece exchanges. This move aims to improve the knight's scope by offering it a more active outpost on c2, while simultaneously preventing white's bishop from returning to a more aggressive diagonal. The move 3-3, rc1 aims to contest the open c-file, which is crucial for controlling key squares and potentially launching an attack or defending against black's initiative on the queen side. This pawn push aggressively challenges white's control of the king side and aims to open lines for black's pieces, potentially creating counterplay or a mating attack. This move challenges black's advanced pawn and aims to disrupt their central control and create counterplay on the king side. This pawn push weakens the kingside pawn structure, creating potential targets on g6 and f6 while failing to address the central tension. This move opens the central pawn structure, creating dynamic possibilities and potentially destabilizing black's king safety. This pawn capture opens the f-file, creating tactical possibilities and potentially activating black's king by creating a passed pawn situation for white on the e-file. The king moves forward to a more active central square, initiating an endgame maneuver that aims to leverage its enhanced mobility and control over key central squares. This move exploits the exposed king by forcing it into a mating net and is a critical defensive resource to prevent further king centralization. This move seeks to escape the perpetual check initiated by black's rook and bishop. prioritizing king's safety over material or immediate counterplay. The rook's move to h2 is a bold attempt to exploit the exposed white king and create counterplay, leveraging the open files and potentially threatening checkmate if white isn't careful. White's king is now actively repositioning to a more central square, preparing to support the pawns on the kingside and potentially join the defense against black's advancing king. Black centralizes the rook to the second rank, preparing to challenge white's rook on the e-file and potentially create counterplay against the white king. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the kingside by advancing the h-pawn, which could become a powerful attacking force if white can successfully support it. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create an open file for the rook, potentially offering counterplay against the exposed king. The king has reached a safe square on h4, now centralizing and preparing to support the pawn storm on the kingside. This checks the king, forcing it to move and disrupting white's king's safety, while also preparing to mobilize black's rook. The king cautiously retreats to g3, seeking refuge behind the pawn shield and maintaining central control after the exchange sacrifice. This move unnecessarily weakens the kingside pawn structure and fails to address black's growing activity on the queenside and center. With the opponent's king exposed after the pawn push and subsequent checks, the white king must retreat to a safer square to avoid further tactical complications and prepare for a potential counterattack. The rook's repositioning to h2 aims to control the h-file and prepare for potential kingside activity or a rook lift, while the pawn structure remains complex with black needing to coordinate its pieces effectively. The rook on e1 is actively repositioned to the center of the board, preparing to support the pawn push on the kingside or to exert pressure on the e-file. The rook sacrifice with rh3+ is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by forcing the white king into a more exposed position and potentially opening lines for the remaining black pieces. The king retreats to e4 to escape the discovered attack from the rook on e2 and to prepare for further defensive and offensive maneuvers. The pawn sacrifice on h4 opens lines for the king and queen, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing black to defend actively. This pawn capture opens the f-file for white's rook and attacks black's king, forcing a reaction and simplifying the position in white's favor by creating an open file. This move recaptures the pawn, simplifying the position and aiming to activate the bishop by clearing the g5 square for potential maneuvering. This move repositions the white king to a safer square on the f3 square, allowing it to support potential pawn advances on the kingside and escape potential checks along the central files. This check forces the white king to move again, further delaying white's development and allowing black's rook to become more active on the 7th rank. The king's exposure on the h-file makes this check a natural tactic to gain breathing room and force the black king further into the center where it can be attacked more effectively by white's remaining pieces. Black's king is still exposed, and the move simply continues to tuck it away, seeking safety behind the pawns. The king retreats to g2, seeking safety from the active black bishop on c5 and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. This move begins a counterplay on the kingside, aiming to disturb white's king and potentially create a passed pawn on the h-file. This move repositions the rook to the 3rd rank, reinforcing the defense of the pawn on e4 and preparing to potentially challenge black's control of the open files. This move, 49, bf6, aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it can potentially challenge white's control of the central dark squares and prepare for potential piece exchanges. Considering the pawn structure on the kingside. This move exploits the unprotected status of black's knight on d5 and forces a decisive material exchange, simplifying into a winning endgame for white. This capture is forced to avoid losing the knight, but it allows white to establish a strong passed pawn on d5 after the ensuing exchanges, fundamentally changing the pawn structure and creating new attacking possibilities for white on the queenside. The rook sacrifice forces a decisive material advantage, simplifying into a winning endgame by capturing the knight and maintaining the pawn majority. With white having just captured the rook on d5, black must now reposition the king to safety, as it is directly attacked and has no other pieces to defend it. This move repositions the rook to control the open b file and potentially support further pawn advances or create threats against black's king. This move aims to improve the rook's placement on an open file, potentially creating threats along the 7th rank and supporting further pawn advances or piece activity. The rook captures the passed pawn on b4, solidifying white's advantage by removing a dangerous attacking piece and gaining material. The move aims to centralize the king and prepare to contest the b4 pawn, which is currently the only pawn that has advanced significantly. The rook moves to b6, solidifying its control over the b file and preparing to advance the passed b pawn, which is now a serious threat to black's king and queen. This move aims to control the d4 square, which is currently a key outpost for white's rook, and potentially prepare to activate the bishop on d4 in conjunction with the rook on b6. The rook move to d6 initiates a strong positional threat, aiming to exploit white's weakened pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create new attacking avenues. This move initiates the liquidation of material, aiming to transition into a simplified endgame where white's active rook and potentially a protected passed pawn on the queenside offer good winning chances. This exchange simplifies the material, leading to an endgame where white is up a pawn and aims to convert this advantage by activating their king and rook. With the exchange of queens and rooks, the endgame is now simplified, and black must consolidate their king's position to avoid further material loss. The king steps forward, aiming to join the active play and support the potential pawn advances, which is crucial in this simplified endgame to create mating threats or break through black's defenses. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the kingside and potentially support further pawn advances once the central pawns are more mobile. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, preparing to support the advance of the central pawns and potentially attack black's king if it becomes exposed. The king repositions to a more active square, preparing to support the pawn endgame and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. The king actively advances to the center, aiming to contest the remaining pawns and support potential breakthroughs or exchanges. The king actively participates in the endgame, repositioning to the center to control key squares and prepare for potential pawn advances or defense of its own king. The bishop repositions to c5, controlling key central squares and preparing to potentially harass white's king and pawn structure. On the queenside, the move b7 reinforces the knight's position and prepares to support the central pawn push, aiming to keep the queenside structure intact. This move initiates the advance of white's g-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn or open lines for the king while potentially gaining space and attacking black's central pawn structure. The bishop retreats to d8, preparing to potentially support a kingside pawn advance or to redeploy to a more active square. while the white rook on d6 remains a significant threat to the black king. This move reinforces the king's central position, preparing to support the d-pawn's advance and contest the center with the opponent's king. This check forces white's king to a more vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially prepare further kingside activity or consolidation of black's bishop and rook. The king repositions to g4, seeking to support the g-pawn's advance while also preparing to join the defense of the d5 pawn against black's rook and bishop. This move is a tactical blunder. The bishop is now attacked by the rook and will be lost, leading to a significant material disadvantage. The white king advances to a more active square, aiming to support the central pawn majority and contest the king's walk towards the queenside endgame where black's king is currently positioned. The king repositions to the center, aiming to support the advanced pawns and prepare for the endgame battle where king activity is paramount. The king is brought to the edge of the board to support the pawn push, aiming to create a passed pawn or restrict black's pieces. The move steers the king to a safer square, preparing to support the pawn push to g5 and consolidate the advantageous pawn structure that white has achieved. The bishop's repositioning to b6 is a sound positional move, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or create threats against black's king if it becomes exposed. The bishop retreats to c3 to maintain its central influence and defend against black's knights potential advance on d4. This move initiates a final push to promote the g-pawn, leveraging the discovered attack on the black bishop and the king's active central position. The bishop retreats to d2, seeking to reposition on a more active diagonal and potentially support a future pawn push on the king's side, while keeping an eye on the vulnerable king. The king's move to f6 aims to solidify the central kingside presence and prepare to support the pawn push in the endgame, offering better opposition to black's active pieces. The bishop advances to c3, checking the white king and forcing it to a less active square, while simultaneously protecting the knight on e5, maintaining defensive pressure. This move repositions the king to a more active square, eyeing potential opposition and preparing to advance to support the passed pawn, which is a key strategic objective in this endgame. Black's bishop repositions to d2, seeking to control the crucial c3h8 diagonal and potentially support advances on the queenside or defend the king if it becomes exposed. This move pushes the passed pawn, aiming to create a decisive threat that white's king cannot effectively stop and forces a favorable pawn endgame. This move is a desperate attempt to reposition the bishop to a more active square. But it's too late. The pawn majority on the queenside and the advanced kingside pawns for white are poised to promote. The king's centralizing maneuver is crucial for supporting the pawn majority and contesting the open files that will emerge after further pawn exchanges. This move places the bishop on a more active diagonal, but it might be vulnerable to a tempo gain by white's king if it advances further. bd4 reclaims space on the queenside, creating an active outpost and potential for increased pressure on black's rook and bishop. Coordination. The move b5 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, which is a critical strategic objective when one side has a pawn majority there, as white has demonstrated by pushing pawns on the kingside. White repositions the king to e4, aiming to centralize it and prepare for further king activity to support the pawns or contest squares on the kingside in the endgame. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the b-pawn, forcing the white bishop to either remain passively defending or to abandon its post. potentially opening lines for black's rook. The move b3 aims to blockade the pawns and prepare for the final endgame simplification where white's king will be more active, with the opponent's king potentially exposed. Consolidating the bishop on c3 prepares to support advances or create mating threats by controlling key squares. This move stabilizes the king's position and prepares to blockade the b-pawn after white's final pawn advance. The bishop retreats to e1, a defensive repositioning to protect the king and prepare for potential counterplay along the e-file, anticipating a long endgame battle. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key diagonals and support the advance of the b-pawn while simultaneously preparing to exchange off black's active bishop. The knight's repositioning to f2 aims to consolidate the position by offering a defensive retreat option and preparing for potential kingside activity or support for a pawn push. The current position is the result of a sharp semi-Slav defense that transitioned into a complex endgame. White has successfully navigated the opening, liquidated some material, and now aims to capitalize on black's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create a passed pawn. The move 77, k4 is a fundamental defensive maneuver, bringing the king to a more central and active position, where it can support the pawn majority on the kingside and also be ready to participate in defense or attack as needed, while keeping an eye on the vulnerable b4 pawn. The bishop now retreats to c5, maintaining central influence and preparing to defend the d6 pawn should it become a target after further pawn advances. The white king retreats to a more secure square, preparing to support the advance of the d-pawn and consolidate its position in the endgame. With the white king vulnerable and the queens off the board, black's bishop on e7 is crucial for defending the g7 pawn and supporting potential counterplay on the kingside. The white king is making a crucial advance to control the center and prepare for potential passed pawn promotion, directly confronting black's passive bishop and aiming to restrict its mobility. The king repositions to a more active square, aiming to support the rook's infiltration and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This move clinches the pawn advantage, creating a passed pawn on the queenside and simplifying into a winning endgame where white's extra material will be decisive. This move aims to centralize the bishop and potentially support a further pawn advance with the d-pawn, aiming to blockade white's passed pawns or create counterplay on the kingside. White delivers a decisive check, forcing the black king to a vulnerable square and setting up the win of the bishop. This move correctly captures the bishop, simplifying the endgame and aiming to exploit the remaining pawn structure in white's favor. The pawn push b4 aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, restricting the opponent's king and bishops. 82. Kf5 is a timely move, bringing the king closer to the pawn majority and preparing to support its advance, which is crucial in this endgame where pawn races are the primary means of creating a decisive advantage. The king advances to a more active central square, aiming to support the passed pawn on b4 and coordinate with the remaining pieces for the final endgame assault.